Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for Where Men Win Glory, The Odyssey of Pat Tillman by Jon Krakauer. Pat Tillman was a football player. He played in college in the 90s and then was signed to an NFL team in, I think, 98 or 99. He played there for a few years and was offered a multi-million-dollar contract, but when 9/11 happened, he decided to turn down the contract and instead join the army. 2 years later, he was killed by friendly fire, and this is the story of his life and his death. I gave this book 3 stars, and I was a little disappointed by that because I normally give Jon Krakauer's books 4 or 5 stars. I love him a lot. I think he's one of my favorite nonfiction authors, but this book fell a little short for me. And it's not that I thought it was any less well done. I want to stress that his books are very well researched, they're very well written. This was just as good as all his other books. It's just that I rate on personal enjoyment, and I enjoyed this book less because of the subject matter. When I picked this book up, based on the synopsis and the way it was discussed, I thought a lot of this book was going to be about Tillman's death and the friendly fire incident and the cover up that happened after. And that was what I was interested in, that was what I cared about. And instead, a lot of this book was just about his life and his motivations for joining the army, which is fine. That's not a bad story. It was just a story that I personally wasn't that interested in. He didn't actually die until about page 250 out of this 350 page book. If you're interested in learning more about Tillman as a person, I definitely recommend picking this up because it was a great character study of him. He just happened to be a character that I wasn't interested in and honestly didn't particularly like. I personally found him kind of unlikable, which isn't to say I thought he was a bad person. He just reminded me a lot of the entitled football players I went to high school with. And I might also be a little prejudiced just because I was very irritated by all the football players and the emphasis put on football at my high school. So while I love sports, football always has a little bit of a sour note for me. But since I didn't like Tillman, that did make reading this book more unpleasant. Krakauer repeatedly said how sensitive he was, how caring, how intelligent, how kind, how humble, but it seemed like every anecdote he offered of Tillman kind of just illustrated how hot-headed or arrogant or self-centered he was, and that just irritated me. It wasn't like I hated him. I didn't hate him. He just seemed like kind of a jerk at times, and just mostly pretty entitled, like he'd gotten his way a lot over being talented at football and talented at a few other things and started to just assume that he inherently deserved more, which is what a lot of the football players at my high school acted like, and I just found it a little bit unpleasant to read for that. In high school, it was discussed how he got in frequent fights, and eventually, at one point, he beat someone so badly that he put them in the hospital, and then he was charged with assault with a deadly weapon that got reduced to a misdemeanor because the judge didn't want him to lose his football scholarship, and that just kind of irritated me. I get people make mistakes, but there's a difference between making a mistake and then putting someone in the hospital. Like that's not a mistake. That's just a terrible thing to do. And then there were just like a bunch of small things like he would be in the off season so he wasn't playing football, but his wife would still be working and she would have to work in the morning and he'd stay up all night partying and being loud even though she like would ask him to stop, and eventually she'd just live with the fact that he was going to be loud even though she had to get up for work in the morning. Or once when he was in Paris, he told a Frenchman that he'd be speaking German if it wasn't for them, and it was little things like that that added up and just made me kind of irritated with him, which again is not to say I thought he was a terrible person, he just seemed like he was kind of a jerk at times. And that wouldn't have mattered if this book had been about his death and the aftermath of his death, but it really wasn't. It was a lot about him, and it was an interesting character study. I wasn't interested in the character that was being studied. But onto the positives, because there were a lot of positives in this book. I really enjoyed the political elements. I was a child when 9/11 happened. I was like 7 turning 8. And I do remember it. I remember a lot of small details at the time. Like, I remember Jessica Lynch. I remember hearing a story about her on NPR. But again, being that I would have been like 9 maybe when the Jessica Lynch story broke, I didn't understand what it was, and I never like followed the story through, you know? I just heard little sound bites. And it's interesting how wrong some of those sound bites were, and how different the actual story is to what I remember. Or even not if it's different, it's just that what I knew was so vague that it was almost vague to the point of being meaningless. That reading this book actually filled in a lot of knowledge that wasn't entirely new, but was mostly new. It was fascinating to read. And this book was also kind of interesting for the political elements because Krakauer usually works so hard to take himself out of his stories to write from an impartial third party perspective. But in this book, it had a fairly strong liberal bias, which I didn't disagree with. His facts were sound. It was just he analyzed those facts in a very liberal way, and it amused me when compared to his other books. There was a lot more of his opinions in this, even though he tried not to write them that way. And I 100% agree with his analysis and conclusions. It was funny to me. I was also fascinated by all the discussions on Friendly Fire because I really had no prior knowledge of Friendly Fire other than like I knew it happened, but I didn't know the extent to which it happened. I think one of the stats he gave at the end was that 41% of the casualties in Iraq, fatal and non-fatal, are from Friendly Fire. And like that was horrifying to me because if I'd had to guess before this book, I genuinely would have said that they'd have been like less than 5% probably. That it would be like something that happened but was rare, but almost half. And like from the other stats he gave from prior wars is that's not too high. Like that was I think the highest, but it wasn't the highest by far, and a lot of them were up in like the 30s, like the Gulf War and the Vietnam War. It was kind of ridiculous to read. Like, I had no idea. And that kind of brings me to the cover up part of this book, which is that I believe that the army covered this up. I mean, there's all this evidence, but it's like, if the stat is 41% of combined fatal and non fatal casualties in the Iraq War was 41%, that's so high, and how little I hear about it and how little I expected it to be. The army does a really good job of covering that up or keeping that on down low. Like I had no idea. And that's incredibly sketch. Like not to sound too casual about it, but like that's kind of terrifying that the army does such a good job of hiding that fact or not hiding it, but just keeping it out of the public view and not talking about it. No one talks about it. And that's kind of absurd to me. But like after reading this book, yeah, it makes sense. And there was one section that was by a career ranger. He was a guy who'd been in the ranger for many years. This was his career. He wasn't doing like a 3 year tour. He was signing up every 3 years to stay in the army. And he left after the Pat Tillman incident. He decided not to sign up for the Rangers again and just entirely left the Rangers because he said in every instance that he was in the army where he saw them choose between right and wrong, they chose wrong. And he also said, which was really powerful to me, he said that if he had died in a friendly fire incident like that, and the army had just told his wife the same lie that they told Pat Tillman's family, his wife never would have figured out the truth because he wasn't famous, so it wouldn't have been newsworthy. She just would have continued on believing that he was killed by the Taliban like the army had implied. The only reason this was a news story about Pat Tillman was because Pat Tillman himself was news. And it makes you think about all the other people who must have been killed in friendly fire incidents, whose families still believe that it was the Taliban and who don't know it was friendly fire. And it really got me thinking. There was a lot in this book that had me thinking. And I genuinely considered giving it 4 stars for that because there was a lot I enjoyed. It was just so much of this book literally just was about Pat Tillman, and that was the part I really didn't care about. The friendly fire stuff, the politics, the military, it all seemed like a very small part of this book when compared with Pat Tillman as the person, and that was why I kind of leaned down towards giving it 3 stars instead of 4. I had a little bit of trouble following the military stuff just because I feel like all military books are kind of hard to follow if you don't understand military chain of command and military titles and weapon names and all of that, because it's just like a lot of big words that don't really make much sense and they all just kind of jumble together. But like I followed it well enough that I understood what was going on, so that wasn't a big problem. And I know nothing about the military, so I feel like that shouldn't be a big problem for many other people either. The only last small critique I have is just there was kind of a bit of sexism in this book, and it definitely wasn't coming from Jon Krakauer. Like, I've read enough of his books to tell what's coming from him and his tone versus what's coming from the people he's writing about, because since it is nonfiction, he's kind of like just capturing these people that he doesn't have control over what they say or do. And there was a bit of like a boys will be boys vibe around Pat Tillman's childhood, like his getting into fights and the way that was treated. And there was also just like some lines later in the book that were very like indicative of gender roles. At one point, his wife made a comment about how he was getting so sensitive, he was growing breasts, and things like that that were very small. It did bother me to read about. It was kind of unpleasant to read about. I really don't enjoy sexism in books unless it's critically discussed in some way, and it wasn't here. It was just like part of this world, part of these people's lives. And it wasn't a big deal. It didn't happen a lot. It was just something that did kind of stand out to me. But this was still a worthwhile book, even though I only gave it 3 stars. I was on the line, but at the end of the day, it was a 3-star book for me. But I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in the subject material, and especially if you're interested in Pat Tillman or his motivations for joining the army, or who he was and what he was like as a person, because that's honestly what a lot of this book is about. It's 2/3 biography of Pat Tillman, 1/3 friendly fire in the army. It's just unfortunate that I was interested in the 1/3. I also buddy read this with Cozy Reader Kelly. I will link her channel down below. I think she gave it 4 stars. We had pretty similar thoughts, I think, about this book. I think she just enjoyed it that little bit more than I did. Let me know down below if you've read this book and what you thought of it if you have. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.